A successful attorney abandons his wife because she can't give him children. 5 years later, he sees her again at a legal conference, but she's not alone. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. I want children, Rachel. Real children of my own blood. The words hung in the air of their Upper East Side apartment, sharp as broken glass. Rachel Harrison gripped the edge of their marble kitchen island, her knuckles white against the stone. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan's lights blurred through her tears. There are treatments we haven't tried, she whispered, hating how her voice shook. Dr. Thompson said. I'm done with doctors. Blake's voice was winter cold, precise as the three-piece suits he wore to court. I'm done with treatments. I'm done with watching you cry every month. He straightened his tie, a nervous habit she'd once found endearing. I'm filing for divorce. The moment stretched between them like a thread about to snap. Rachel stared at her husband of 7 years, trying to reconcile the stranger with the man who'd promised to love her forever. I, Blake Harrison, take you, Rachel Elizabeth Cooper. The memory hit her with physical force. Their wedding day 7 years ago. Blake's eyes shining as he slipped the ring onto her finger, both of them drunk on champagne and possibilities. His mother crying happy tears in the front row, his father's proud smile. The way Blake had kissed her like they had all the time in the world. You can't mean this. Rachel pushed away from the counter, taking a step toward him. We're partners, Blake. We built this life together. Remember when we first moved in? We couldn't even afford furniture. We ate takeout on the floor for months. Something flickered in Blake's eyes, pain maybe or regret, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. That was a different life. A different me. He turned to look out at the city he'd conquered, at the empire he'd built. Harrison and Associates billed $15 million last year. I'm not the same person who ate Chinese food on the floor. Rachel watched his reflection in the window, remembering how gradually things had changed. The late nights at the office stretching longer. The way his mother's hints about grandchildren grew from gentle to pointed. The silence that filled their home, heavy with unspoken accusations. Last month, she said quietly, at your mother's birthday party? Don't? His shoulders tensed. But Rachel couldn't stop. The words poured out like poison she needed to expel. When she announced to everyone that she was still waiting for her first grandchild. The way you looked at me across that room, Blake. Like I'd failed you. Like I wasn't enough. He turned to face her, and for a moment she saw the raw pain beneath his careful facade. You're young, Rachel. 32. You can still have the family you want with someone else. Someone who can give you children. I want you, she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. How long had it been since they'd truly wanted each other? Since they'd been partners instead of opponents in this endless war of disappointment? The movers are coming tomorrow. Blake picked up his briefcase, checking his watch, the Rolex she'd given him for their 5th anniversary. I'll be staying at the Pierre until I find a place. Rachel watched him walk to the door, his steps echoing on the hardwood floors they'd chosen together. He paused with his hand on the handle, and for one wild moment she thought he might turn back. I'm sorry, he said, not looking at her. Then he was gone. The next day, Rachel sat on the window seat, watching the movers empty their home. 7 years of shared life sorted into his and hers, packed away in labeled boxes. She'd insisted on overseeing it herself, needing to witness the dismantling of her marriage. As the last box disappeared down the hall, something caught her eye beneath the radiator. She reached down and pulled out a photograph, its edges worn soft with handling. Her breath caught. It was from their honeymoon in Bali. They were on the beach at sunset, his arms around her waist, both of them laughing at something forgotten. She traced Blake's smile with her finger, remembering how it felt to be that loved, that sure. The photo blurred as tears fell, dotting the image like rain. Outside, thunder rolled across the Manhattan sky, and Rachel curled into herself on the window seat, alone in an empty apartment that still echoed with the ghosts of broken promises. The Brooklyn apartment felt like surrender. Rachel stood in the empty living room, surrounded by boxes labeled in Madison's neat handwriting, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon light. No floor-to-ceiling windows here, no marble countertops. Just honest hardwood floors that creaked under her feet and a radiator that clanked like an old man's cough. It has character, Madison had insisted while helping her sign the lease. Rachel wondered if character was just a kind word for nothing like your old life. Her phone buzzed, another message from her sister. First box Tuesday, kitchen stuff. Second box Tuesday, bathroom. Third box. Rachel smiled despite herself. Madison's determination to organize her chaos was both annoying and comforting. The smile faded as she pulled out her day planner. Red circles marked her upcoming medical appointments like drops of blood on the pristine pages. Dr. Thompson had insisted on running the full panel of fertility tests, even though Rachel wasn't sure why she needed to know any more. Because, she whispered to herself, I need to know if he was right. 2 weeks later, Rachel sat in a sterile exam room, her hands twisted in her lap as Dr. Thompson reviewed her results. The doctor's face gave nothing away as she flipped through the charts. Well? Rachel's voice cracked on the word. Dr. Thompson looked up, and there was something like triumph in her smile. Your results are perfectly normal, Rachel. All your hormone levels, your egg count, everything, you're completely fertile. There's no medical reason you couldn't carry a healthy pregnancy to term. The words hit like a physical blow. Rachel pressed her hand to her mouth, tears spilling over. All those nights of silent blame, all those accusing looks, and she'd been healthy all along. Would you like a moment? Dr. Thompson asked gently. Rachel shook her head, wiping her eyes. No, I need to get to class. Teaching had become her anchor in the storm of divorce, her students at Columbia Law the only constant in her upended life. That afternoon, she threw herself into lecturing about tort law, drawing strength from the engaged faces before her. When Jessica Chin, a bright-eyed first year, stayed after class to ask about family law precedents, Rachel felt something like her old passion stirring. Professor Harrison, Jessica began. Professor Cooper, Rachel corrected automatically. She'd gone back to her maiden name, shedding the last visible tie to Blake. The weekend brought another kind of test. Rachel was studying labels in Whole Foods, trying to remember how to shop for one, when she heard a familiar voice. Rachel? Oh my goodness, sweetheart. Eleanor Harrison stood at the end of the aisle, elegant as ever in cashmere and pearls. Before Rachel could escape, her former mother-in-law had enveloped her in a cloud of Chanel No. 5. You look thin, dear. Are you eating? I've been so worried. Eleanor's concern felt like acid on Rachel's skin. Blake's not himself either, you know. Just yesterday I told him. Please, Rachel interrupted, her voice tight. Please don't. But dear, if you'd just talk to him. The carton of eggs Rachel had been holding slipped from her numb fingers, shattering on the floor. Yellow yolks spread like small suns at their feet. Rachel stared at the mess, seeing instead all her broken dreams. I have to go, she whispered and fled, leaving her half-filled cart and Blake's stunned mother behind. She didn't remember calling Madison, but 20 minutes later her sister found her sitting on the floor of her new bathroom, surrounded by scattered groceries from a different store. I couldn't go back in there, Rachel explained, her voice hollow. I just couldn't. Madison sat down beside her, careful of the spilled rice. Then we'll shop somewhere else. She picked up a bruised apple, turning it in her hands. You know what? I never liked Whole Foods anyway. Too pretentious. Like their organic air is better than regular air. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside Rachel, surprising them both. It was small and watery but real. There you are, Madison said softly. I was wondering when my sister would come back. That night after Madison left, Rachel dug out the box of wedding photos she'd been avoiding. One by one, she fed them into the small fire she'd built in the apartment's decorative fireplace. She watched her past turn to ash, their engagement party at the plaza, the rehearsal dinner at Lou Bernardine, the wedding at St. Patrick's. But when she came to the honeymoon photo she'd found beneath the radiator, her hands stilled. The edges were soft, worn by time and touching. She studied her younger self, seeing past the designer dress to the ambitious law student who'd believed in love and justice in equal measure. You're still here, she whispered to that smiling girl. Instead of burning the photo, she propped it on her nightstand, not as a memorial to what she'd lost, but as a reminder of who she'd been before she was Blake's wife. Before she was anyone's wife. In the morning she would begin again. The wine bottle was empty and midnight had come and gone. Rachel lay on her living room floor beside Olivia, both of them staring up at the ceiling where taxi headlights painted moving shadows. You could do it, you know, Olivia said, breaking the comfortable silence. Have a baby on your own. Rachel turned her head to look at her best friend. You're drunk. Tipsy, Olivia corrected, propping herself up on an elbow. And I'm serious. You're financially stable, emotionally ready, and according to your tests, perfectly fertile. Why wait for some hypothetical future husband? The word husband still stung but less than it used to. Rachel sat up, hugging her knees to her chest. My parents would have a collective heart attack. Your parents had a collective heart attack when you chose law school over medical school. Olivia's voice softened. But they got over it. Because they love you. That conversation planted a seed. Over the next few weeks, Rachel found herself staying late at her office, using Columbia's academic access to research fertility clinics and sperm banks. Each evening, she added more notes to a growing document titled Project Future. The confrontation with her parents came sooner than she'd planned. Over Sunday dinner at their Connecticut home, her mother Martha noticed the fertility clinic brochure peeking out of Rachel's purse. "What's this?" Martha's voice wavered as she read the cover. "Rachel Elizabeth Cooper, please tell me you're not considering having a baby on my own?" Rachel finished, setting down her fork. "Yes, I am." Her father's face reddened. "This is ridiculous. You're upset about Blake, we understand that, but this isn't about Blake." Rachel's voice was steady, surprising herself. "This is about me. About what I want." "What you want?" her mother repeated faintly. "What about what's right? What about giving a child a proper family?" "I am a proper family," Rachel said. "Me and whoever else I choose to include in my life." The drive back to Brooklyn was silent until Madison, who'd witnessed the whole scene, spoke up. "I'll help you." "What?" "Financially," Madison clarified. "I've got savings. And before you protest, it's an investment in becoming an aunt." Tears blurred the road ahead. "Mad. Just promise me I get to spoil them rotten." The process of selecting a donor was both more clinical and more emotional than Rachel had expected. She spent hours scrolling through profiles, reading medical histories, educational backgrounds, personal essays. "This one," she said finally, showing Madison and Olivia the profile one evening. "He's a literature professor at Yale. 6 feet tall like Blake." She paused, then continued more firmly. "But that's not why. Listen to his essay about why he's donating. Books taught me that family isn't about blood, it's about love, choice, and the stories we write together." The day of the procedure, Rachel lay on the clinic bed, staring at the sterile white ceiling while Dr. Thompson prepared everything. A nurse held her hand, standard procedure probably, but Rachel gripped it like a lifeline. "Are you ready?" Dr. Thompson asked. Rachel closed her eyes, thinking of all the paths that had led her here. The marriage that failed. The test that proved her whole. The family that questioned her choices, and the family she'd chosen for herself. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." That night, she opened the leather-bound journal Madison had given her and began to write. "Dear future child, today I took the first step toward meeting you. I don't know if it will work, science is amazing, but there are no guarantees. What I do know is that you are already loved. Not just by me, but by your Aunt Madison, who believes in us enough to help make this possible. By your Aunt Olivia, who sparked this whole journey with a late-night conversation. Your grandparents, they're struggling with this choice. But I have to believe that when they hold you, when they see your face and count your fingers and toes, they'll understand. Love has a way of changing people's minds. I want you to know that you weren't a reaction to loss, or a way to fill an empty space. You are a deliberate choice, a leap of faith, a declaration that family can look however we decide it should look. Maybe this month will bring you to me. Maybe it will take longer. But I promise you this, I will never make you feel like you need to be more than you are. You will never have to earn my love. I can't wait to meet you. Love, Mom." Rachel closed the journal, pressed her hand to her still flat stomach, and smiled into the darkness. For the first time since Blake had walked out their door, she felt completely, unshakably certain. This was right. 3 minutes felt like 3 years. Rachel sat on the edge of her bathtub, phone timer ticking down, trying not to stare at the pregnancy test on the counter. She'd done this before, too many times to count during her marriage, but this time felt different. This time she was alone by choice. The timer chimed. With trembling fingers she picked up the test. 2 pink lines, clear as dawn. "Oh my God," she whispered. Then louder, "Oh my God." Her hands shook as she texted Madison and Olivia. It worked. Across town, in the sterile confines of Harrison and Associates, Blake Harrison was having a very different morning. Sarah, the junior partner he'd been dating for the past 2 months, stood in his office doorway, arms crossed. "You canceled dinner again last night," she said, her voice carrying that familiar edge of disappointment he'd hoped to never hear again. "The Peterson case is already lost, Blake. Everyone knows it. Just like everyone knows you're spiraling." He wanted to argue, but the headline on his computer screen made it impossible. Tech giant Vertex ends 20-year partnership with Harrison and Associates. His biggest client, gone. Just like that. The next week brought change for Rachel too. Dean Richards called her into his office, and she tried not to notice how the morning sickness made the room spin slightly. "We want you to head the department," he said without preamble. "You've shown remarkable resilience this past year, and your students' evaluations are exceptional." Rachel blinked. Thank you, sir. But there's something you should know." She took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant." His smile didn't waver. "Congratulations. The position is still yours if you want it." She did want it. God, how she wanted it. The first ultrasound appointment was scheduled for a Wednesday morning. Madison took off work to come with her, holding her hand as the technician spread the cold gel on Rachel's still flat stomach. "Let's see what we have here," the technician said, moving the wand. Then she paused, adjusted something and smiled. Oh my. Rachel's heart stopped. "Is something wrong?" "Not at all." The technician turned the screen. "See these two separate sacs? Congratulations, you're having twins." The world tilted. Rachel grabbed Madison's hand harder, tears spilling down her face. "Twins? Twins?" Madison was crying too, laughing through the tears. "Mom and Dad are going to flip." Later that night, Rachel called her parents. Her mother answered on the first ring as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "It's twins," Rachel said without preamble. "You're getting 2 grandchildren." The silence stretched for one heartbeat too. Then she heard her mother's shaky inhale. "Oh, sweetheart. Are you happy?" "Yes, Mom. I really am." Another pause. "Then we are too." Weeks passed in a blur of morning sickness and department meetings. Rachel's small Brooklyn apartment began to transform. Olivia, who'd apparently spent hours on Pinterest, arrived one Saturday with paint samples and determination. "Sage green," she announced. "Gender neutral, calming, and it'll grow with them." They painted the nursery together, Rachel insisting she could still reach the lower parts of the walls despite her growing bump. As they worked, Olivia filled her in on the latest legal world gossip. "Blake's firm is struggling," she said carefully, watching Rachel's reaction. "Sarah left him, professionally and personally. Apparently, he's not the easiest person to be around these days." Rachel focused on her painting, surprised to find the news didn't hurt anymore. "I hope he finds what he's looking for," she said, and meant it. The surprise came during her Thursday afternoon class. Rachel walked into the lecture hall to find it decorated with streamers and balloons. Her students, led by Jessica Chin, had organized a baby shower. "We know you said no gifts," Jessica explained, "but we couldn't let our favorite professor become a mom without celebrating." The gifts were thoughtful and practical. Books, gift cards, 2 identical onesies that read "Future Lawyer." But it was the card that made Rachel cry. Every student had written a message and they all shared a theme: strength, inspiration, gratitude. "You showed me that life doesn't have to follow a traditional path to be beautiful," one read. "Thank you for teaching us about law and life," said another. That evening, Rachel sat in the newly painted nursery, surrounded by baby shower gifts. She could smell the fresh paint, hear the familiar creaks of her Brooklyn apartment, feel the first flutter of movement in her belly, or was it 2 flutters? Her phone buzzed with a news alert: Harrison and Associates faces class action lawsuit. She swiped it away without reading further. That was another life, another story. Instead, she opened her journal and began to write. "Dear babies, today your future students threw us a party." Yes, I said students, because I have a feeling you'll be spending quite a bit of time in lecture halls. Your mom is now a department head, if you can believe it. Some people might say this is terrible timing, but I think it's perfect. You're teaching me already about strength, about joy, about how the best things in life rarely follow our carefully laid plans. I felt you move today. Or maybe it was your sister. Brother? I don't know yet, and somehow that makes it even more magical. You're already your own little people with your own secrets. The nursery is ready. Aunt Olivia insisted on sage green walls. Aunt Madison bought 2 of everything. And your grandparents, they're coming around. Sometimes love takes a little longer to bloom, but that doesn't make it any less real. Keep growing, my little ones. We have quite the adventure ahead of us. Love, Mom. The first contraction hit during a faculty meeting. Rachel gripped the edge of the conference table, trying to breathe through the sudden, sharp pain. She was only 34 weeks along. "Rachel?" Dean Richards noticed first. "Are you all right?" She shook her head, already reaching for her phone to call Madison. "The babies? It's too early." Everything moved in a blur after that. The rush to Mount Sinai, the urgent voices of doctors, the terrifying words "premature labor." Madison arrived first, still in her scrubs from her shift at the pediatric ward. Olivia burst in minutes later, having abandoned a client meeting mid-sentence. 8 centimeters, the nurse announced. These little ones are in a hurry. Rachel gripped her sister's hand. Matt, I'm scared. I know, Madison soothed, wiping Rachel's forehead with a cool cloth. But you're not alone. We've got you. 4 hours later, the first cry pierced the delivery room. Baby A is here, the doctor announced. It's a girl? Emma, Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face as they placed the tiny bundle on her chest. But there was no time to marvel. The contractions were starting again. 12 minutes later, Lily arrived, announcing her presence with an even louder cry than her sister. Strong lungs on this one, the doctor chuckled. The twins were small, Emma at 4 pounds 8 ounces, Lily at 4 pounds 6 ounces, but healthy. As Rachel watched them in their NICU incubators, she felt a love so fierce it frightened her. But with that love came darkness. The first few weeks at home were a fog of sleepless nights and endless feedings. Rachel found herself crying for no reason, drowning in a sea of anxiety and doubt. I can't do this, she sobbed one morning after trying for an hour to get both babies to latch. I'm not enough for them. Madison, who'd been staying over to help, took one look at her sister and made a call. An hour later, Dr. Lisa Chen, a postpartum specialist, was sitting in Rachel's living room. What you're feeling is real, Dr. Chen said gently. And it's not your fault. Postpartum depression doesn't mean you're a bad mother, it means you're human. With therapy, medication, and the relentless support of her village, the fog began to lift. Olivia organized a meal train that kept Rachel's freezer stocked for months. Her mother came every Wednesday, insisting on taking the night shift so Rachel could sleep. Even her father, who'd been the most resistant to her choice, became a regular fixture, reading stories to the twins in funny voices that made them coo. The first time Rachel really felt like herself again was during the twins' first Christmas. The Brooklyn apartment was crowded with family, the tiny artificial tree dwarfed by piles of presents. Emma and Lily, now plump and thriving at 5 months, wore matching Santa dresses that made everyone's hearts melt. Remember when you thought she was making a mistake? Olivia whispered to Rachel's mother, watching as Rachel nursed Lily while singing carols. Martha wiped away a tear. The only mistake would have been standing in the way of this. January brought unexpected news. Dean Richards called Rachel into his office, careful to schedule around the twins' napping schedule. We're offering you tenure, he said, sliding the paperwork across his desk. Your research on family law reform is groundbreaking, and you've managed to maintain exceptional teaching evaluations while raising twins. You're exactly the kind of professor Columbia needs. Rachel stared at the papers, thinking of all the late nights writing while the girls slept, all the time she'd worn a baby carrier while giving lectures. Thank you, she said. This means everything. The twins' first birthday party was a celebration of more than just their birth. It was a tribute to the family they'd created, not the traditional one Rachel had once imagined, but something stronger, built on choice and love and unwavering support. Emma, already showing signs of being the adventurous one, smashed her cake with gleeful abandon. Lily, more methodical, carefully picked off each piece of frosting before eating it. Rachel watched them, these perfect mirrors of each other who were already so uniquely themselves. Later, after the guests had gone and the twins were asleep, Rachel sat in the nursery's rocking chair, surrounded by the remnants of the party. The sage green walls were now adorned with photos documenting their first year. The twins' NICU graduation, their first smiles, Rachel's tenure celebration with both girls in her arms. She opened her journal, a habit that had become her anchor. Dear Emma and Lily, today you turned 1. 1 year of love, of growth, of figuring out who we are as a family. It hasn't been easy. There were days when the darkness felt overwhelming, when I wasn't sure I could be what you needed. But you, my precious girls, taught me that strength isn't about doing it all perfectly. It's about getting up each morning and trying again. Emma, you took your first steps today, toddling straight into Aunt Madison's arms. Lily, you said your first clear word, book, which made your grandfather insufferably proud. You're so different yet so connected. When one of you cries, the other immediately tries to help in your own baby way. This year has been about more than just watching you grow. It's been about watching our whole family grow around you. Your grandparents, who were so afraid of this unconventional path, now can't imagine life without their double blessing. Your aunts, who've been there through every triumph and terror. Even my students, who've become used to seeing 2 car seats in my office during office hours. I used to worry that you'd feel something was missing in your life. Now I know better. You have more love, more support, more family than I ever dreamed possible. We did it, my darlings. We made it through our first year. Happy birthday, my beautiful girls. Love, Mom. The Peterson case was going badly. Blake could feel it slipping away as he stood before the judge, his vision blurring at the edges. The courtroom felt too hot, too bright, and his chest ached with a strange pressure he'd been ignoring for weeks. Mr. Harrison? Judge Winter's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you all right? Blake opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The last thing he saw was the judge's alarmed expression as the courtroom tilted sideways. He woke up in Mount Sinai's cardiac unit, surrounded by beeping machines and the sharp smell of antiseptic. Megan, his girlfriend of 6 months, sat beside his bed, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her phone screen. Finally, she said, looking up. You scared everyone half to death. The case was adjourned. Her voice had an edge to it. The doctor says you had a panic attack complicated by extreme exhaustion and... She checked her phone, something called acute stress response. Blake closed his eyes. He'd been working 80-hour weeks since losing Vertex, trying to keep the firm afloat. Trying to prove something to someone, though he wasn't sure anymore who that someone was. The doctors insisted on a full battery of tests. Blood work, stress tests, hormone panels. Blake submitted to them with growing irritation, wanting only to get back to work. But when Dr. Matthews asked to see him in his office rather than discharge him, something cold settled in his stomach. The good news is your heart is basically healthy, Dr. Matthews began, shuffling through test results. But we found some other concerns. Your hormone levels, specifically. Blake's world narrowed to a single point as the doctor continued speaking. Words like azoospermia and non-obstructive floated past him. But one sentence cut through everything else. You're infertile, Mr. Harrison. And based on these results, you always have been. That's impossible, Blake said automatically. Run the tests again. We did. 3 times. The room felt too small suddenly. Blake loosened his tie, the same nervous gesture he'd made the day he left Rachel. I need another opinion. 3 more specialists delivered the same verdict. Each time, Blake's denial cracked a little more, until finally it shattered completely in a sterile office on the Upper East Side. I want children, Megan had been saying just that morning. I'm not getting any younger, Blake. Now he sat in his darkened office, a glass of scotch untouched on his desk. The irony was suffocating. He'd destroyed his marriage, blamed Rachel, started over with someone younger. All because he wanted children. And all along. His mother's arrival was announced by the sharp click of heels in the empty hallway. Eleanor Harrison had always had perfect timing. The doctors called, she said from the doorway. Were you planning to tell me? Blake didn't look up. It's none of your business. None of my. She crossed the room in 3 angry strides. You divorced Rachel over this. You blamed her, humiliated her at my birthday party, threw away 10 years together. 7, he corrected automatically. We were married 7 years. And you were together 3 before that. Eleanor's voice softened slightly. All that time, did you ever get tested yourself? The silence was answer enough. Oh, Blake. His mother sank into the chair across from him. What have you done? He picked up the scotch, then set it down again without drinking. I've lost everything, haven't I? Your firm can recover. That's not what I mean. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. I saw Rachel last week, she said finally. At that coffee shop near Columbia. She looked happy. The words hit like a physical blow. Blake opened his desk drawer and pulled out a photo he'd kept hidden for months. Their wedding day, Rachel laughing as he twirled her on the dance floor, both of them young and drunk on possibilities. I was so sure, he whispered. So sure it had to be her. Because if it wasn't, if it was me, then you couldn't be perfect anymore? His mother's voice was gentle now. Oh, my darling boy. When did you start believing you had to be perfect to be loved? Blake stared at the photo until it blurred. Outside his window, Manhattan glittered with its usual indifference to personal tragedy. Somewhere out there, Rachel was living her life, teaching her students, maybe even dating again. And here he sat, surrounded by the wreckage of his pride. Megan's leaving, he said. She wants children. And you can't give them to her. Eleanor reached across the desk and took his hand. Just like you couldn't give them to Rachel. But that's not why you lost Rachel, Blake. You lost her because you couldn't bear to be vulnerable. To be human. The scotch sat between them, amber and untouched. Blake thought of all the moments that had led him here, the accusations, the silent treatments, the way he'd turned his pain into Rachel's fault. He'd built his law firm on an ability to see truth, yet he'd been blind to the most important truth of all. I need to apologize to her, he said finally. Yes, his mother agreed. But not yet. First, you need to apologize to yourself. Blake looked around his office, at the awards on the walls, the view he'd worked so hard for, the empty chair where his wife used to sit when she brought him dinner during late nights. All of it suddenly seemed like a grand construction designed to hide a simple truth. He was just a man as fallible as anyone else. The truth, when it finally emerged, wasn't just about his infertility. It was about the cost of pride, the weight of unexamined assumptions, and the way love dies not in grand moments, but in small choices made day after day. Blake finally picked up the scotch and poured it down the sink in the corner of his office. Then he did something he hadn't done since the day Rachel left. He cried. The Boston Convention Center hummed with activity as Rachel reviewed her notes one final time. 5 years ago, she would have been nervous about keynoting the National Women in Law Conference. Now, with tenure secured and twin daughters who regularly challenged her to think on her feet, public speaking felt almost easy. Professor Cooper? A student volunteer appeared at her elbow. They're ready for you. In the back of the grand ballroom, Blake Harrison slumped in his chair, wondering why he'd let his senior partner talk him into attending. The firm needed to show face after the Peterson disaster, but surely someone else could have. Please welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Rachel Cooper from Columbia Law School. Blake's head snapped up. The woman walking onto the stage couldn't be Rachel. But it was her honey blonde hair, shorter now, cut in a confident bob that framed her face. She wore a deep blue suit that made her look both powerful and elegant. But it was her smile that caught him off guard, bright, genuine, unguarded. When had he last seen her smile like that? Thank you all for being here, Rachel began. Today we're going to discuss the evolving definition of family law, and how our legal framework needs to adapt to modern realities. Her voice was strong, assured. As she spoke about changing family structures and the need for more inclusive legislation, Blake found himself leaning forward, drawn in despite himself. This wasn't the woman he'd left 5 years ago. This was someone entirely new, or perhaps, he realized with a jolt, this was who she'd been all along before his expectations had dimmed her light. The audience was captivated. Rachel fielded questions with ease, her responses thoughtful and often gently humorous. Then, just as she was wrapping up, a commotion at the back of the room drew everyone's attention. Mommy? 2 little girls, identical in purple dresses, came bursting through the doors. Behind them, Madison appeared, looking simultaneously apologetic and amused. Sorry, she mouthed to Rachel. They couldn't wait. The audience melted as Rachel laughed, holding out her arms. The twins raced down the aisle and scrambled onto the stage, each claiming one of their mother's legs. Everyone, Rachel said into the microphone, it seems my timing committee has decided we're done. Meet Emma and Lily, my most demanding critics. The room erupted in delighted laughter and applause. Blake couldn't breathe. The world had narrowed to those 3 figures on stage, Rachel, confident and glowing, and 2 perfect little girls who could have been his daughters in another life. One of the twins whispered something in Rachel's ear, making her throw back her head and laugh. He barely registered the rest of the afternoon's sessions. At 5 o'clock, he found himself alone in an elevator with Rachel. She was checking something on her phone while the twins played some kind of clapping game beside her. Hello, Rachel, he managed. She looked up, and he saw the microscopic tensing of her shoulders, the only sign that his presence affected her at all. Blake, I heard you were here. Your speech was, you were amazing. Thank you. She smiled politely, then turned to the twins. Girls, this is Mr. Harrison. He's an old friend of Mommy's. Emma and Lily paused their game to study him with identical blue eyes, Rachel's eyes. Hello, they chorused, then immediately went back to their clapping. The elevator ride lasted approximately 10 years. At the conference dinner, Blake discovered that the universe had a sense of humor. Not only was he seated at Rachel's table, but directly across from her. The twins were with Madison for the evening, and Rachel was deep in conversation with a Supreme Court clerk about her latest research. She handled it all with remarkable grace, included him in conversations when appropriate, neither avoided nor sought his attention. It was Blake who kept knocking over his water glass and losing his train of thought. The girls are beautiful, he said during a lull in conversation, his voice low enough for only her to hear. They look just like you. They're my miracle, Rachel replied simply. Then after a pause, I heard about your firm's troubles. I hope things are improving. The gentleness in her voice nearly undid him. She had every right to be cold, to glory in his professional struggles. Instead, she was showing him a kindness he hadn't earned. "We're rebuilding," he said. I'm rebuilding a lot of things actually." Rachel met his eyes for the first time that evening. "I'm glad," she said softly. "Everyone deserves a second chance at happiness, Blake." Before he could respond, she was drawn into another conversation about her work. Blake watched her as she spoke passionately about legal reform, her hands moving expressively. She wore no rings, he noticed, but her bare fingers spoke of choice rather than lack. As the evening wound down, Rachel gathered her things to leave. "The girls have swimming lessons early tomorrow," she explained to the table. "It was lovely meeting everyone." She paused by Blake's chair on her way out. "Take care of yourself," she said, and then she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume, different from what she'd worn during their marriage, he noticed. Another small sign of how much had changed. Blake remained at the table long after the other guests had departed, nursing a glass of sparkling water. Through the ballroom's windows, he could see the Boston skyline glittering against the night sky. Somewhere out there, Rachel was going home to her daughters, to the life she'd built from the ashes of their marriage. He pulled out his phone and looked at the conference schedule for tomorrow. Rachel was leading a morning panel on single parenthood and the law. He'd be there, he decided. Not to try to reclaim what he'd lost. That ship had sailed, but to truly see the woman Rachel had become. Perhaps that was part of rebuilding too. Learning to face the consequences of your choices without flinching away. The morning panel had just ended when Blake caught up to Rachel in the hotel lobby. She was checking her phone, a small frown creasing her forehead. "Rachel." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Could we talk? Please?" She looked up, studying him with those clear blue eyes that had once known all his secrets. "There's a coffee shop around the corner." The cafe was quiet for a Boston morning, most of its customers already gone to work. Rachel chose a table by the window, setting her conference badge aside like armor she no longer needed. "You're going to tell me about your infertility," she said before he could speak. At his startled look, she added, "Legal circles talk, Blake. I heard about your collapse in court, the medical tests." The prepared speech he'd rehearsed all night crumbled to dust. "How long have you known?" 3 months. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I considered calling you when I found out. But it wasn't my place anymore." The sunlight through the window caught the gold in her hair, reminding him of mornings in their Manhattan apartment. How many breakfasts had they shared in silence, the weight of unborn children heavy between them? "I'm sorry," he said finally. "God, Rachel, I'm so sorry." "For what, exactly?" Her voice was steady, but he could see the tension in her fingers. "For blaming me? For walking away without even getting tested yourself? For making me feel like I was broken?" Each question hit like a physical blow. "For all of it. For being a coward." "You were worse than a coward," Rachel said quietly. "You were cruel. Do you know what it's like to have your husband look at you like you've failed him? To sit at dinner parties and watch him change the subject whenever someone mentions children? To lie awake at night wondering if this month will be the month you finally deserve to be loved?" Blake's vision blurred. "I was scared," he whispered. "Terrified. The firm was taking off, everyone was watching us, expecting greatness. Children were just the next achievement on the list. When it didn't happen, I couldn't face the possibility that I was the problem. So you made it my problem instead." "Yes." The admission felt like glass in his throat. "I built my whole identity on being perfect, on never failing. And when I couldn't give you what you wanted." "What I wanted?" Rachel's laugh was sharp. "You were the one obsessed with having children. I would have been happy just being us. But you couldn't bear the thought that something might be wrong with the great Blake Harrison." He opened his mouth to defend himself, then closed it. She was right. Of course she was right. Rachel's phone buzzed, lighting up with a FaceTime call. The twins' faces filled the screen, both of them talking at once. "Mommy? Aunt Madison let us get blue ribbons for swimming and I went underwater for 10 whole seconds and Emma splashed the teacher, but it was an accident." "Was not." Rachel's whole face transformed as she listened to them, love radiating from every feature. Blake found himself leaning forward, drinking in the details of their faces. Emma had a small freckle above her right eyebrow. Lily's smile was slightly crooked. They were beautiful and they were strangers to him. "I'll be back for lunch, sweethearts," Rachel promised. "Be good for Aunt Madison." After she hung up, the silence felt heavier than before. "They're incredible," Blake said softly. "You've done an amazing job with them." "They saved me," Rachel replied. "After you left, I could have let bitterness consume me. But then I got pregnant and suddenly I had a choice to make. I could stay angry or I could become the person my daughters deserved. Someone strong. Someone whole. She met his eyes across the table. That's what you never understood, Blake. Having children isn't about achieving something. It's about becoming something. A better version of yourself. I see that now. He swallowed hard. Watching you with them, seeing the woman you've become. I understand what I threw away. No, Rachel said firmly. Don't rewrite history. You didn't throw away this version of me. She didn't exist then. Your leaving, as painful as it was, forced me to grow into myself. To stop being Blake Harrison's wife and become Rachel Cooper. Mother. Professor. Woman in her own right. Blake nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle into his bones. Can you ever forgive me? Rachel was quiet for a long moment, watching the Boston morning unfold outside. I already have, she said finally. Not for your sake but for mine. Carrying that anger was exhausting. And the girls deserve a mother who knows how to forgive. She gathered her things, preparing to leave. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting Blake. And it doesn't mean going backward. I know. He managed a small smile. Forward is the only direction you've ever really moved anyway. Rachel paused, her hand on her bag. I hope you find peace with yourself, she said softly. The world doesn't need a perfect Blake Harrison. It just needs you to be real. She left him there in the quiet cafe, surrounded by the ghosts of what might have been and the clear light of what was. Through the window, he watched her walk away, her steps confident and sure. She didn't look back. What do you feel when you think about that morning in Boston? Dr. Sarah Klein's office was warm, filled with soft light from the Manhattan sunset. Blake studied his hands. Relief, he said finally. And grief. Not for losing Rachel. I grieved that years ago. This is different. Like mourning the person I could have been if I'd faced my fears sooner. And how are you facing them now? He thought about the fertility support group he joined, about sitting in a circle of men sharing their stories of loss and shame. One day at a time. Across the city, in a Brooklyn kitchen filled with the scent of pasta and laughter, Rachel was having her own conversation. I still can't believe Eleanor Harrison called you, Olivia said, chopping basil while the twins did homework at the counter. She was different, Rachel replied, stirring the sauce. Softer somehow. She said seeing Blake broken helped her understand how her perfectionism had shaped him. Madison, perched on a stool between her nieces, looked up from helping with math problems. Are you okay? Really okay? Rachel considered the question. The Boston confrontation had stirred up old feelings, but not in the way she'd expected. I feel lighter. Like putting down a weight I didn't know I was still carrying. Mommy? Lily's voice was hesitant. Jessica at school says everyone has a daddy. Where's ours? The kitchen went silent. Emma stopped pretending to do her math and watched her mother intently. Rachel sat down between her daughters, choosing her words carefully. Your story is a little different from Jessica's. I wanted you both so much that I chose to have you on my own, with help from doctors who specialize in helping people become parents. But didn't you love anyone? Emma pressed. I did, Rachel said softly. I was married once to a man named Blake. But sometimes love isn't enough if you're not ready to be your truest self with each other. Is that why you're not married now? Lily asked. Yes. And it's also why I learned to be stronger, which helped me be ready to be your mom. Later that night, after the twins were asleep, Rachel opened her journal. Sometimes the universe has a strange way of bringing closure. Seeing Blake broken open, finally honest, should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like watching someone emerge from a long dream. His pain is no longer mine to carry, but I can witness it with compassion. Across town, Blake sat in his darkened office, a different kind of documentation before him. He was writing letters, to Rachel, to his mother, to his younger self, that he'd never send. Dr. Klein called it processing grief. I'm sorry, he wrote, for making my fear your burden. For not understanding that vulnerability isn't weakness. For missing the chance to see two perfect little girls take their first steps. The moon hung full and bright over the city, casting identical squares of light through different windows. In Brooklyn, Rachel stood on her small balcony, wrapped in a sweater against the spring chill. In Manhattan, Blake looked up from his desk, drawn to the same celestial light. At the fertility support group the next day, Blake spoke for the first time. I lost my marriage because I couldn't face the truth about myself, he told the circle of understanding faces. But the real tragedy wasn't the infertility. It was the pride that made me blame someone else for my deepest fears. A young man across the circle nodded, tears in his eyes. Blake saw his younger self in that face and felt something new, the ability to help someone else heal. Eleanor's visit to Rachel's office at Columbia was unexpected but not unwelcome. "I brought photos," she said, pulling out an envelope. "From before. Everything. I thought the girls might like to know where their mother's smile came from." Rachel accepted the envelope, touched by the gesture. "You've changed," she observed. "Watching your child suffer changes you," Eleanor replied. "Even when that suffering is of their own making. Perhaps especially then." That evening, Rachel spread the photos out on her kitchen table. The twins leaned over them, fascinated by this glimpse of their mother's past. "You looked happy," Emma said, pointing to a Christmas photo. "I was," Rachel replied honestly. "And then I was sad for a while. And now I'm happy again, but in a different way. That's how life works sometimes. Like when I was sad about not making the swim team, but then I got better at swimming?" Lily asked. Rachel hugged her daughter close. "Exactly like that, sweet girl." Later, both Rachel and Blake found themselves awake in the small hours, watching the same moon slide toward morning. In Brooklyn, Rachel worked on her latest paper about evolving family structures, her daughters sleeping peacefully down the hall. In Manhattan, Blake drafted proposals for his firm to offer pro bono services to fertility clinics. They were connected not by what they had lost, but by how they had grown from the losing. The moon watched over them both, silent witness to the ways healing happens, not in great dramatic moments, but in small choices to face each day with more truth than the last. The Brooklyn brownstones' backyard bloomed with streamers and laughter. Emma and Lily's 6th birthday party was in full swing, the spring air filled with the sound of children playing and adults chatting. Rachel watched from the patio as Dr. James Chin, her boyfriend of 8 months, taught the twins and their friends how to make giant soap bubbles. "He's good with them," Blake observed, appearing beside her with 2 cups of lemonade. He offered her one. "He is," Rachel agreed, accepting the drink. "The girls adore him. Though they still call him Dr. James, no matter how many times he tells them James is fine." They shared a comfortable silence, watching the scene before them. The past year had changed them both. Blake's therapy had softened his sharp edges, while Rachel's relationship with James had added a new warmth to her already full life. "Your gifts were perfect," Rachel said. "How did you know they were into astronomy?" Blake smiled. "I pay attention during those support group sessions when you mention them, though I didn't expect them to immediately start planning a mission to Mars. That's Emma's influence. Lily just wants to bring a library to space." The twins had opened their presents earlier, telescopes from Blake, carefully chosen with input from Madison and Olivia. His note had been simple, "For 2 bright stars. From your friend Blake." Across the yard, James caught Rachel's eye and smiled, that warm, steady smile that had first drawn her to him when they met at one of the twins' checkups. He understood about Blake, about the complicated tapestry of her past. More importantly, he understood that her daughters would always come first. "I'm happy for you," Blake said quietly. "James seems like a good man." "He is." Rachel turned to study her ex-husband's profile. "And you seem lighter. The support group helps. So does being honest with myself. And others." He paused. "I'm seeing someone too. Another group member, actually. Sarah. She understands." Rachel nodded, remembering how hard it had been to date as a single mother, to find someone who understood her journey. "I'm glad." "Mommy?" Lily came running up, her party dress slightly damp from the bubbles. "Can we have cake now?" "Emma says we have to wait, but I'm hungry." "5 more minutes, sweet girl," Rachel laughed. "Why don't you show Blake your new space book?" Lily's face lit up. "It has real pictures from the Hubble telescope. Come on." She grabbed Blake's hand without hesitation, pulling him toward the garden bench where her book lay. Rachel watched them go, struck by how natural it felt, this new version of family they were creating. James appeared beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Better than okay," she replied, leaning into him. "Just thinking about how life surprises you." The cake was a masterpiece of astronomical proportions, designed by Madison, 2 planets orbiting a bright fondant sun. As everyone gathered to sing, Rachel looked around at the assembled faces. Her parents, finally at peace with her choices. Eleanor Harrison, taking photos with unabashed grandmother pride. Madison and Olivia, the sisters of her heart. James, solid and kind beside her. Blake, finding his place in this expanding universe of love. And at the center, her daughters. Emma with her wild dreams of space exploration, Lily with her quiet wisdom and love of stories. Both of them products not just of biology, but of choice and courage and the unwavering support of this unconventional family. Everyone gather for a photo. Madison called after the cake was cut. Birthday girls in the middle. They arranged themselves on the patio steps. The twins front and center, Rachel and James behind them, Blake and his Sarah to one side, the grandparents, the aunts, the cousins and friends. Just before Madison set the timer, Emma reached up and grabbed Blake's hand, pulling him down to kneel beside her. "You too," she said firmly. "Your family now." The camera captured that moment of surprised joy on Blake's face, the gentle understanding in Rachel's eyes, the proud set of James's shoulders. It captured two little girls surrounded by more love than they could comprehend, and all the adults who had learned that family was not about blood or obligation, but about choice and growth and forgiveness. Later, after the guests had gone and the twins were asleep upstairs, Rachel sat in the quiet garden. James had gone home, promising to help clean up tomorrow. The moon was rising, the same moon that had witnessed so much of their story. She opened her journal one last time. "Dear Emma and Lily, today you turned 6 and I watched our family, in all its beautiful complexity, celebrate you. Someday you'll understand how many kinds of love it takes to raise a child. The fierce love of a mother, the steady love of a good man, the healing love of forgiveness, the chosen love of friends who become family. Your story began with loss, but it bloomed into something more beautiful than I could have imagined. You have a mother who learned to stand alone, a father figure in James who chooses you every day, and yes, even Blake, not a father but a friend who helps you reach for the stars. This is what I want you to remember. Family is not about fitting into a perfect picture. It's about creating your own masterpiece, one brush stroke of love at a time. You are my masterpiece, my bright stars, my greatest adventure. Love always, Mom." The garden was peaceful in the moonlight, still decorated with streamers and stray bubbles that caught the silver light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new chapters in their ongoing story. But tonight, Rachel sat in the quiet and felt the rightness of it all. This life they'd built, this love they'd chosen, this family they'd created against all odds. Above her, the stars winked like distant promises, and somewhere in the vast night, two little girls dreamed of space while their mother dreamed of everything they could become. If this story touched your heart, please tap the like button and subscribe to our channel for more moving narratives about love, growth, and the many ways families can heal and evolve.